The NES is very well known when it comes to lifting the gaming industry up when it needed it the most. Consoles were a dime a dozen, and games, especially, were coming out at varying degrees of quality on a consistent basis, but the NES became the gold standard for how to handle a console and its games. But there is one more system that not many people talk about, even if it was Nintendo's strongest competitor: the Sega Master System. This system was home to many aspects of what most remember Sega fondly for, but it is a somewhat forgotten console in our current era, a fate that it does not deserve. In this mini documentary, we will discuss what this system was capable of, its games, and why it wasn't as impactful as it should have been. The Master System, as we know it, launched in September of 1986. However, in Japan, it launched as the Sega Mark III 2 years after the Famicom, its main competitor. Meanwhile, the Master System was a direct competitor to the NES internationally. The Nintendo Entertainment System is famously designed to look the way that it does because Nintendo was afraid that in the United States, it wouldn't get a second look if it resembled your typical gaming system that many were so burnt out of. Sega went for a completely different approach. The Master System does still look and feel like a gaming system by comparison. This is a pretty long, rectangular system, matte black by default with many details that allow it to stand out. I'm mostly referring to the red accents. On the front, you will find a power switch, 2 controller ports, and a card input slot. This is a very interesting slot, as it actually behaves like a second cartridge slot. It is intended for Sega cards, which are much lower capacity cards that are cheaper to source to developers and publishers than a normal cartridge, allowing smaller budget games that require a lot less data to be stored to work off of them, hence saving publishers and developers money along the way. On the top, you will find labels for those exact same buttons and ports that I mentioned, as well as a reset and pause buttons with a mind map that shows you what I assume are the steps for connectivity, and of course, the cartridge slot itself. Now, Sega's cartridges were quite small when compared to Nintendo's, but they generally held the same amount of data, which was typically around 512 kilobytes. Unfortunately, these standard Master System cartridges didn't have any artwork on the front, just the name of the game, which was certainly a missed opportunity. On the back, you will find an AV out port for composite, a channel switch for RF, an RF port, and an AC adapter port for power. The Master System supports a resolution of up to 192p through this port, but just like the NES, it only supports mono audio. The Master System has another port known as the expansion slot. This was meant to be used with other accessories, but on my unit it seems to be completely internal, with no way of accessing it unless you remove the top. And this is actually because while the hardware that supports other accessories does exist within these Master System units, Sega opted not to use the slot outside of Japanese units. The Master System also came with a rectangular controller, which looks pretty similar to the NES's, but there are many key differences. The Master System's controller is significantly smaller and especially thinner. This controller uses an 8-directional pad, which allows for fluid movements between directions, specifically when it comes to rolls and the like. Then the only 2 buttons on this controller are the A and B buttons, which feel mushy, but that's within my expectations. I find this controller to be more comfortable to use for a long period of time when compared to the NES's. Since I have small hands and the control pad feels more seamless to use, but the NES does have higher quality buttons with more satisfying feedback from its D-pad. Both controllers were good, and Sega kept things pretty simple. However, there's more to the Master System beyond just its exterior, as this is quite a capable system, and one that was meant to compete with the Titan that became the NES. Now, Sega had been in the console market for some time before the Master System launched, with one of those earlier systems and its predecessor being the SG-1000. This was Sega's first third-generation system released in July of 1983, competing with the Famicom. But Sega wanted to put more demanding games on their system, and the SG-1000 CPU simply wasn't cutting it to handle more hardware-intensive titles. This is what led us to getting the Mark III and Master System respectively. Actually, the Master System seemed to be a little more capable than the NES in some respects, being a console that was launched after Nintendo's original offering, particularly when it came to it having a wider color palette, and performance seemed to be a bit better, with some claiming that games that made it onto both the NES and Master System looked better on Sega's console. The game that comes to mind for many when they think about the Master System is probably Hang On. This was a launch title, one that was actually bundled with early releases of the console. The Master System was also home to accessories like the light gun to play games like Safari Hunt, as you point your toy at your TV. The Master System even had 3D glasses which allowed you to wear the display on your face and play much more immersively, which was a novel idea. Other games that come to mind are Phantasy Star, Golden Axe Warrior, Wonder Boy and Monsterland, Psycho Fox, and many more. I would actually describe many of these games looking pretty similar to NES titles, but there definitely are games that looked incredible on the Master System, where the NES didn't have games that looked as impressive. One game that comes to mind was one that was only available on Sega's consoles, Sonic the Hedgehog. This game is incredibly vibrant and detailed, unlike most games on the NES which appear to have more limited details. Games like Asterix: The Great Rescue also made great use of the expansive color palette of the system, being incredibly vibrant. This was a genuine pro when it came to Sega's offerings. Another aspect that attracted developers and publishers to Sega was that Master System cartridges were not that expensive, and those Sega cards also helped a lot when it came to allowing publishers and developers of varying budgets to support their system. And the Master System was actually very successful in some regions, but it unfortunately remains ignored in others. Everyone knows that the Master System, or Mark III, were incredibly popular in Europe, Australia, and even Brazil. But even in its home country of Japan, it was not holding a candle to the Famicom. This is also the case here in the United States, where not many people care that much about the Master System. All of the attention seemed to be on the NES, and Famicom, of course. It was almost night and day, seeing how these regions overwhelmingly favored one system over the other. Now, Sega actually released multiple revisions of the Master System, including a Mark II model that was smaller and still played a lot of the same games as the Model 1, but it didn't have a Sega card slot, composite connection, and expansion slot, as it was intended to be a cheaper version of the same system. This was done as this console was released in 1990, right after the 4th generation console race began, and Sega supported this console endlessly, launching as many games as possible and expanding the Master System to be played in different budgets with cheaper models, and even coming out with the Game Gear, which was essentially a portable Master System with some features that we take for granted today. But it didn't really matter. The NES was so dominant and shook things up in the States in such a way that there was just no turning back for the majority of new and old gamers. The NES had massive titles such as Super Mario Bros., all the way up to the 3rd game in the series, which were a lot of fun, and the talk of every town along with it having games like Final Fantasy, Kirby's Adventure, the Zelda games, which were really popular among others, along with it having a ton of third-party support that made a huge difference, at least enough for the Master System to be left behind in both Japan and North America. This time around, it was an issue of reach and frankly a very well-timed launch with consistent support from Nintendo, but many would argue that the Master System deserved a lot more recognition for being technically more powerful and supporting more visually impressive games than the competition. The Master System launched just a few short years before the turn of the generation, and as such, the very end of the decade itself, but it was undeniable that Nintendo had the more popular console, as by the end of it all, the NES sold around 61.91 million units worldwide. Sega continued supporting the Master System for years after the 3rd generation ended, with one of the last games ever released on the system being the Smurfs Travel the World in 1996, 2 generations later. Even so, the support continued across the Genesis era with the power-based accessory that makes your Genesis backwards compatible. Sega loved the system, and they didn't want it to die, but eventually it did. In Japan, it was discontinued in 1991, in North America in 1992, In Europe, it lasted all the way up until 1996, and in Brazil, it is still being manufactured to this day in 2025. But another company, Tectoy, is handling production around it. While its legacy is very minimal in the States, it has been incredibly long-lasting and impactful in other regions in ways that I never would have expected. And this is truly incredible, but Sega themselves only sold about 13 million units worldwide, with the bulk of these sales coming from Europe and Brazil. But Tectoy is estimated to have sold about 8 million more units since they took over. Obviously, the Master System is dearly beloved, and for very good reason. Sega had an interesting rise in the console market, with a very well-known meteoric defeat towards the end of the short life of the Dreamcast, as they transitioned into publishing games instead. I look forward to making a mini documentary on Sega's time in the hardware business, as well as talk about the Game Gear at some point. So please make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss either of those mini documentaries when they eventually come out. Now, thank you so much for watching. Leave your suggestions in the comments for future bite-sized documentaries, and do consider pressing the hype button on this video to boost it in the algorithm. And sharing it also helps out a ton. Until next time.